And now we're live.
It's
Hello,
off.
hello. I did not expect to stream today, but this is a friend of mine from Twitter, Geolibertarian George. He's a George's libertarian. Well, right now I think he is in Germany.
Indeed.
Um, yeah. Also, can you explain what Georgism is?
Yeah, sure thing. So to sort of explain what Georgism comes from, we should go back to sort of how John Locke discusses the origins of private property rights in the Second Treatise of Government, where he basically very explicitly states that um, private property rights begin with the act of applying labor to natural resources. And in doing so, labor has created wealth. The argument's obviously extended to capital, since capital is basically the stored product of labor to generate more wealth, to create more wealth in the future. So basically, the idea is from Locke that all of the returns to labor and capital are legitimately private property and are absolutely so. That um, that laborers and capitalists have absolute domain over what they create, and um, have obviously have the right to distribute it as they see, and those who acquire such types of property also have just domain over such property and have absolute property rights to that. However, Locke, what he does specify in his description of property is that the sort of natural domain, land, natural resources, so on and so forth, are something that belong to the commons. And there's a sort of ethical, sort of equal right of all of us to be able to access land, to access natural resources, which we all need in order to create wealth. And he explicitly specifies this with the Lockean proviso, where he states that basically after people sort of claim or sort of have a claim to resources and create wealth with it, there must be enough access to land and natural resources and of all qualities um, for everyone to be able to do the same. And this is a sort of an argument from Locke that gets overlooked, I feel like, by a lot of right libertarians, especially ANCAPs, who often reference Locke's views with respect to homesteading, but don't really sort of recognize the Lockean proviso. And Georgism is sort of founded upon Locke's views as expressed. With respect to what constitutes absolute private property rights and what constitutes sort of common claim to property. And the idea is that basically it's applied through the realm of taxation, where basically there's absolutely no taxes placed on labor or capital, or the income generated from labor or capital, or products of labor and capital that are exchanged. And that the sort of common claim to land or common claim to natural resources would be enforced through a tax on land. George specifically called for a land value tax being the only kind of tax. But the logic can also be applied to, for example, um, harvesting of natural resources, to pollution, destruction of sort of value of natural resources, um, and sort of even other things like, for example, intellectual property. knowledge can in some way be sort of framed as a natural resource that's discovered over time by people. Um, and actually, George, in a later edition of Progress and Poverty, which was his main sort of most famous book where he explains his theories, he actually sort of recognizes this in calling for patents to be abolished. Well, I mean, the same sort of theories on taxation can also apply to patents. And that
Um,
goes through the ethical specification. So, I mean, it basically applies sort of mainstream libertarian thinking on property to the returns to capital and labor, while also calling for a tax on land value. And I mean, that's sort of the ethical argument behind it. There are a number of different economic arguments that are in favor of this. And I'll be more than happy to go through that.
can you lay out one of the economic arguments for the Georgia's tax reform?
Yeah. So the main idea is this, that if we look at the market for a single plot of land, and it also extends to all land in general, single plots of land are a perfectly inelastic good. It's a fixed supply, and there's no marginal cost of production for additional units of land, and so on and so forth. Such that a pure tax on land value would effectively be a fixed cost, and it wouldn't change the amount of land that the landowner would ultimately offer for rent. The incentive for the landowner is to offer the entire plot of land for rent or for sale or so on and so forth. So because of this, ultimately a land value tax would cause no dead weight loss, because it's not affecting the amount or the marginal costs of offering land for rent or sale, because there are none, essentially. And it's a way of basically capturing, if you do it, and George would have called for this, and also, by the way, a number of classical liberal thinkers were in favor of this, not just George. I can go through the list if you want.
Just a name.
Ricardo is one name in particular, but anyways, so basically what happens is that the landlord's surplus is completely captured, or that all the taxes borne on landlord surplus. And since it doesn't change these incentives from the side of the landlord, in fact, those who own idle land would be a bit more incentivized to open it for productive use. And since land rent itself doesn't change any incentives for the producer in terms of the amount that they adjust their production due to marginal incentives, land value tax would basically be a fixed cost for a producer that wouldn't change at all at the margin. The land value tax would be economically efficient. There are also some arguments in terms of distribution of wealth that tends to occur as economies grow, and in particular as technology advances and labor becomes more specialized. You tend to see land values go up quite disproportionately. And there are a number of countries where this has been the case for the last 20 years or so. The United States being one particular case.
Is that why you favor the universal basic income?
Well, that would be one reason for sure. And I mean, that would just be one thing that I would fund out of the collection of land rent. I mean, there are a number of other things that I think it should be used for. And in fact, when public spending is considered, it actually makes the case for the land value tax even stronger. Because when governments spend money on infrastructure, or they spend money on schools and so on and so forth, on universities as well, it tends to attract sort of surrounding community. You tend to see more people sort of invest in the community around it, and land values go up to quite a degree. So, in a way, it's sort of, and actually Joseph Stiglitz, interesting enough, ended up proving this in a paper of his back in the 1970s, where he proved that basically a land value tax that completely captured land rent would that it would capture basically all of the end benefits of public spending. I mean, in a way, it would be like sort of public spending paying for itself. Um, so I think that, and George is quite clear about this, there should be investment in education, investment in infrastructure. I would say generally just investments in opportunities, in expanding productive opportunities, in opening people to the ability of accumulating human capital so that they can be more productive and more desirable in labor markets. I mean, ultimately, it would be sort of a way of, I guess, adjusting for some fundamental inequalities in the economy, but also a way, for example, a major way for investors and entrepreneurs to benefit. There would be sort of a demand stabilizer in place for one. It would tend to open more land for productive use. Opportunities like even a universal basic income, for example, would provide some security for a small-time entrepreneur with a big idea. And there's been a number of different sort of entrepreneurs who have gotten behind the idea for that reason.
So
So I mean,
what's one of sorry,
it's really sort of a way of like, if anything, it's sort of a way of correcting the distribution of wealth, the effects on the distribution of wealth that occur where land value tends to, which is totally unproductive in and of itself, tending to eat up more and more wealth over time, with less wealth actually being distributed to labor and capital both. Because the returns of capital are also eaten into. And this is sort of a fallacy that a lot of left-wingers have. They think that labor and capital are opposing entities when they're not. Their interests are actually aligned. And and this causes a number of other problems, and especially when you consider the current financial system, how it operates with central banking that follows discretionary monetary policy and often has a bias toward quite loose credit policies. And this tends to, since interest rates tend to go lower and lower and lower, what it tends to do is it tends to push credit in the direction of sort of speculative investment. And well, we pretty much saw this leading up to the in the building real estate bubble that led to the crash of 2007. And this ultimately also has a very negative effect on production, because you end up closing off more land to productive use. At the same time, you're building up all these credit obligations without generating the income to pay for it. So this is also sort of another way that a land value tax can operate in an economically optimal way, because it keeps these sort of speculative behavior in land markets under control to some degree.
So what's one of the most common criticism against the Georgia's tax reform?
Oh, well, I would say, I mean, the harshest. Well, I mean, there's there's things like this is something that can piss quite a lot of different people off, right? I mean, Karl Marx criticized Henry George as harshly as anyone else. Um, but I mean, but Karl Marx was, I mean, he was a communist, so nothing short of like full communism would ever please him. And I mean, yeah, it's Marx is one of those guys who got lost quite a bit, I would say, when reading his work. It's interesting because he did make some predictions that were kind of correct, but he didn't arrive at that based on solid analysis, so it prevents him from seeing what the problem really is. Even though in volume 3 of Capital, he begins to sort of realize this, which that was published posthumously. But anyways, I mean, I would say if I was the strongest criticism of Georgism, I would probably determine this based on like sort of the strongest resistance I get um, from, let's say, a particular perspective, and that would definitely be from the ANCAP perspective. Um, they basically have this idea that um, that simply discovering land justifies private property in it, and um, that
And mixing your labor.
well, but like here's the thing. I mean, they would make that argument, um, and they would say that just like not doing anything to it would also um, count as mixing your labor with it. I have heard that argument before. Um, I mean, the thing is that like mixing your labor with it, well, that means that you need to be applying your labor to basically the entire space of the property in some way to approve it, or the land in some way to approve it in order to have an absolute claim, I would say. I mean, obviously, when you plant the crops are yours. When you build structures upon it, the structures are yours. Um, any type of productive capital machinery, that's definitely yours. But then, I mean, you inevitably have other pieces of space that you're not applying your labor to. So the argument would be that there is some sort of claim to what's being excluded, or like to compensation for excluding that. But they would just even say that just discovering something and putting a fence around it is enough, and that therefore, you know, and that anyone who comes after, well, tough luck to them. Um, I, I you know, I just don't see this as being totally ethical. I think that Locke has, with the proviso, provided quite, you know, a sensible and I think pretty unassailable ethical standard. I mean, discovery in and of itself is clearly not enough to um, justify private property rights to something, because if you've discovered something that someone has acquired through their labor or their capital, that maybe was stolen from them, then I mean that's not really yours. I mean, Nozick, for example, would be quite clear about that. Um, who I think really articulates the principle of just acquisition better than anyone. Um, so, you know, if we're operating from a Lockean perspective on land and nature, which I think is the correct one, then I mean, discovering something and claiming it would be in a way theft. And I mean, you're definitely in some way using force to prohibit people from accessing naturally occurring opportunities that nobody created. So, I mean, I would say that's probably the strongest point of resistance that I get from people would be the sort of ANCAP argument for domain over land. Um, I mean, there are some people who would claim that um, that land wouldn't be um, a suitable revenue base to make up for all other taxes. usually these people have made such a claim sort of as an offhand, like Paul Krugman. I saw he made such a claim, but like he didn't even, you know, he didn't even exactly remember that Henry and George had written Progress and Poverty, and he definitely wasn't very well educated on the topic. And what they tend to miss also, such people, is they tend to miss the effects on land value that would occur if you eliminated all other taxes. Since there would be more incentives for production, there would be more demand, the sort of perfect storm of each. You would see land values escalate pretty quickly, because there would be more demand for productive use of land, um, as a result of doing this. I mean, imposing a land value tax would put a check on this to some degree, but it would still increase, and it would get to a level, especially if you think about the sort of uh, theoretical observations of Joseph Stiglitz, when he showed that public spending pretty much gets captured as land rent. Then it's pretty clear that the land value tax would be enough. And also, there have been studies that people have done, where they've shown that, for example, in Australia, land rent would be something akin to about 35% of GDP, whereas current taxes are around or less than 30%. So that actually switching to a land value tax would um, allow for capturing more revenue, and allow for spending on better schools, um, better public infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Just generally better public services. Um, that I think that most of the people who make that argument honestly really haven't looked into things as clearly as they should have. Especially and there are a number of countries where we're getting the numbers showing um, just how major this phenomenon with land value really is, especially in the UK. In the UK now, land value actually accounts for more than half of all net worth. And it's something that's led to quite a situation. There's been a lot of discussion of a housing crisis. You've probably seen Academic Agent post a couple of things about it on Twitter.
Yes.
Um, so, yeah. I hope that my rambling made some sense there.
Yeah. You make some rather interesting points on there. I might look into to your guy George,
Yeah.
because I think the tax reform might fix a lot, might make this society more prosperous.
Yeah, well, I
Okay.
mean, we definitely want that. And it would be in such a way that everyone would really benefit. I think that that's and it would be one that if you pair it with true free market economics, sort of getting out of the way of markets operating, with these taxes on production that we have now, and um, some of the really intrusive regulations, like especially wage and labor laws that we have. Well, I mean, these things wouldn't even really be needed, because I mean, labor would have a lot more opportunities open to them, and so on and so forth. In some ways, I would argue that some of the legal structure in the U.S. actually works against labor. For example, I mean, right to work laws. That's quite an interference, I would say, in the principle of freedom of contractual association, because unions aren't even allowed to negotiate for sort of exclusive contracts with employers. It's unions aren't perfect at all, and same time, I think that just sort of getting out of the way in that kind of situation would be a much more preferable solution to this. I mean, you could certainly even argue that in the process of outsourcing that's occurred, that if unions had a bit more bargaining power, that the Taft-Hartley Act ended up really reducing by allowing for right to work laws to emerge. Unions would have been able to perhaps negotiate some sort of settlement in some of this outsourcing.
Okay.
I mean, you know, you could have seen things like more offering of employee shares, and I think that that's, you know, quite a but I mean, you know, give barriers out of the way of people organizing these things for themselves.
So on the next topic, we're going to talk about what must be done and how can libertarianism can ultimately finds a coherent message, and better yet, like a coherent message and a respectable movement once again.
Hmm. You know, we're not the first people to talk about this. It's sort of been, I guess, what we've always dealt with. And it's a question that everyone's who really adheres to sort of a consistent ethical basis in their political beliefs. And it's something that they're really going to struggle with because, I mean, we're not really inclined to do what mainstream parties and mainstream thinkers do, which is basically to simply just gain support in mass. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of finger pointing, I think, among libertarians. I think the first thing we need to do is end that. I think the first thing we need to do is to sort of ad hominiming the sort of inquisition type behavior that can occur among us, you know, and the sort of just refusal to tolerate any type of disagreement whatsoever on how principles should be interpreted in particular cases. I mean, there's libertarianism allows for disagreement on points. It really does.
Yeah, like I said to you in our DMs, I said libertarianism is really like a broad term that encompasses many ideologies.
Really, it does. And you know, it sort of it blends into, and it blends into how people think yours as well. I mean, there is some overlap with I think there's some overlap with liberalism, like the fundamental, you know, principles of liberalism are individual liberty and equality. I would say mostly equality of opportunity in the case of liberalism. Well, I mean, they've got the liberty part, so there's some overlap there. I mean, then you have, you know, sort of Reagan-style conservatives who, you know, fucking hate paying income taxes, and I think that there is you know, who really values sort of entrepreneurship and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, that kind of thing. Sort of rugged individualism, I would say.
Yeah.
And you know, libertarianism, I think that these are sort of natural types of allies for us. You know, and people who come at things from a bit of a different perspective as well. And I think that we do need to think about outreach, and broad outreach as well, um, because you need to build coalitions in order to get anywhere in politics. I mean, even the two major parties, for example, like there's no like really coherent ideology, I don't think, behind either party, like any coherent, consistent one. Like, I mean, you still got sort of moderate, even kind of Rockefeller type Republicans who are around.
Didn't know there were centrists still in Congress.
Sorry?
I didn't know there were still centrists in Congress. Rockefeller.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you know, even among like the people who are the base of the Republican Party, like you've got your sort of like really business types, who want the low taxes and so on and so forth. And you've got the evangelicals who, I mean, their primary concern is social conservatism, basically.
And also,
And some of the centrists and so on and so forth. Then, I mean, for a while, Tea Partiers had a bit of say. And then it seemed like that the Tea Partiers and some other folks turned into the Trump types. So, I mean, if anything, I think the Republican Party is more of a mess than it's probably ever been. I think you could say the same thing about the Democratic Party.
like it's almost like they just lost their identities over this past decades.
Yeah. Like, I mean, even in the Democratic Party, still, you will find conservative Democrats, you know, like pro-gun, even pro-life Democrats, even someone like Jim Webb, for example. You know, and like I guess the sort of leading line has been like a sort of DLC Hillary Clinton or Clintonite type sort of, I guess you could call it neoliberalism. Or at least their sort of framing of it. But I mean, you've also got the fucking progressives as well. Um, you know, and within the progressives, like so many different sort of interests that at times really conflict with one another. Um, and also your sort of civil libertarians. I think you tend to see those more in the Democrats, um, in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Um, although I guess that depends on what amendment that you're looking at.
uh,
But it's again like the Democratic and Republican parties. They don't have like, you know, I've been living in Europe for some time, right? And there's a multi-party system here in Europe. I mean, pretty much in every country in Europe, you've got 3 or 4 parties who are represented in either the national legislature or in, you know, executive office in ministries, basically. Um, in most of the countries, there's a coalition between a couple of different parties. Um, you know, it's quite a different thing. But the thing is that with all these different parties, you have a lot more clarity on where each of the parties stand. You have more clearly parties that are more clearly committed to principle, and you know the fact that these parties have a chance to win is ultimately a very healthy thing for democracies. Um, I mean, it prevents a sort of situation like we have in the United States with 2 major parties, you know, basically in the end ultimately end up playing to the same people
yeah.
in order to maintain power.
Um,
And Yeah, I mean, it would be. I think that anyone who wants to see radical change in the U.S. at this point, you know, at some point, multiple parties are going to have to rise. I mean, that's the only way that really anything is going to change. I mean, the two major parties have to end up dying, or they have to end up facing seriously strict competition.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, when um, when do you think when the Liberty Movement lost its identity?
um,
Because
yeah, that's a good question.
it seemed like people were just united under Ron Paul back in '08 and
Yeah.
stuff. Just like he was able to pander the more conservative brand of libertarians and the more voluntarist brand of libertarians. Like he was able to just pander all of them and yet remaining consistent with his principles.
Well, not only that, I mean, I think that libertarians in general were just very enthusiastic that a libertarian candidate like him could get quite a bit of traction in a major party contest.
Well,
Um, I mean, I've always come at things from more of a classical liberal standpoint. But I mean, even I was excited as hell about Ron Paul. Um, and I think that like, there's this idea of sort of really hard split among the institutional libertarians between the sort of Cato, Koch brothers funded wing and the sort of paleo libertarian, like Mises Institute wing and all of that. But I mean, if you go back and read what people at Reason were writing about Ron Paul, what, even some people at Cato were writing, it's pretty clear that they wanted Ron Paul to do well. It's pretty clear that they were excited about him. And and the other thing with him is you knew that you could trust him. You knew that like what you were hearing from them was what he really fucking believed. And he had a track record of demonstrating it. I mean, I think that there are personal things about him that um, were really quite inspirational. Um, and he was the first guy who really, I think, got into the mainstream as pretty thoroughly libertarian guy. Um,
yeah, Ron Paul.
yeah,
He
I think. Sorry,
he's
go ahead.
my thoughts on Ron Paul is like he was just like this great uniter. Just he's just like you said before, like people just were really excited about him
Yeah,
and just
yeah, and I think that once he got out of politics, and I mean, it was pretty clear that he was done with the political career.
I
I think
still watch his Liberty Report.
there was nobody really ready to take it up, and I mean, Rand wasn't going to be able to do it. I mean, Rand by that point, and I've met Rand Paul personally because I
Really?
volunteered on the Ron Paul campaign several years ago. I met him in South Carolina in 2008.
Oh,
I mean, I know where he stands. He's like his dad, but
well,
by that point, like I think he had already lost a lot of trust among his dad's core supporters because it looked like he was capitulating a bit. He was responding to politics a bit and sort of framing his stances and so on and so forth.
only
Um,
difference I can tell between Ron and Rand is that Rand is a bit more hawkish than Ron Paul.
yeah, but Rand also, I don't think he throws firebombs as much in terms of rhetoric and platform as his dad did. I mean, like Rand was campaigning on a flat income tax, and I mean, that's not going to excite people at all who are core supporters of his dad. Core supporters of his dad want to hear, fuck the income tax. I, I'm done
And
with
the
that.
Fed.
You know? Like,
And the
and
Fed. Let me smoke weed.
yeah, I mean, and he didn't really address monetary economics that much ever, you know? Um, and let's be honest, like, quite a bit of Ron Paul's support was from gold bugs. Really was. I mean, he had the gold bug community completely sewed up, I think. Um, but I think also, like, I don't know. I mean, I can, I respect Rand for certain things. I think he's stood up to the plate at points on certain topics where in the Republican Party it is not easy to step up to the plate and, put forth a counter narrative, particularly on civil liberties issues. I mean, he's been there. I don't like that he voted for Jeff Sessions, but he's been there when the time has come on those issues every single time. That's incredibly important. Um, I mean, it's incredibly important because government power is starting to encroach and build in ways that encroach all the time in these aspects. And I mean, the scale of the surveillance state now is just, it's really scary. Um,
Yeah, just.
Especially when we consider the government's relationships with the telecommunication industry. It's pretty shocking. Um,
How did we let this happen? How? I mean,
we,
how?
we 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 didn't take this stuff seriously when we should have. Um, I mean, like,
Like, my
you know,
thing,
we could go.
oh, sorry.
No,
My
go ahead.
with the security state is you just get like the problem within itself is the bureaucracy. Just like you get whistleblowers like Edward Snowden just leaking information to the press, and yeah, people like here are getting calling him a traitor. I just honestly think that's more so due to the bureaucracy. You're always going to expect some type of mole to leak in rather important information that shouldn't be out in public. Well, considering that the United States is an empire, especially
Yeah,
competing on the world stage.
yeah, yeah. It's I mean, in the end, well, I'm quite a big Snowden fan because I think what he revealed was incredibly important. Um, and the fact that these policies were arrived at without any sort of public debate is just completely asinine. I mean, these are clear encroachments on the Fourth Amendment, what he revealed. And furthermore, I mean, they really get us into some real shit in foreign countries um, when we start surveilling uh, communications, in foreign territories to the degree that we were. Like, for example, here in Germany, um, it was obscene. And I mean, Merkel sort of undermined her case after it was revealed that we had been monitoring her communications. It was also revealed that the Germans were monitoring John Kerry's communications when he was Secretary of State. So, I mean, she kind of lost moral authority there, but still, that doesn't excuse what we were doing. And I mean, why were we doing this in a country like Brazil? Like, what possible national security interests could we have by surveilling communications of everyday Brazilians?
I don't know,
I mean,
just
as far as I'm aware, there's pretty much zero national security concern that we as the United States have about Brazil, is there? I've
and
heard.
no and no real important natural resource in Brazil, as far as I know.
Ooh, I would disagree.
Do they have oil?
They
Or
they have they have some oil. Yeah, they have a little bit of oil. Um, and I mean, agriculture is quite big in Brazil as well. Um, I don't know if multinationals like want to get involved in that game or whatever, but yeah, I mean, they definitely have natural resources and definitely oil. I mean, there's a
yeah.
major national oil company there called Petrobras.
No, you know what Henry Kissinger once said? To control the nation, you have to control the oil, and and
And the land, natural
yeah,
resources.
that too.
Yep.
I don't really
Yes.
see. I don't see any real, from a real politic perspective, any real natural interest in Brazil.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't see any. I guess for a long time in South America, there have been some multinational corporate interests, um, and I mean, you know, I wouldn't like it if some socialist government came to power and you know stripped them of their capital and such. But like, you can't to try to socially to try to engineer the internal politics of countries is I think that's really beyond our control. Um,
Yeah,
I think you have
maybe
to
that's
find a way
why.
you have to find a way to work with countries when certain governments are in power. Um, I mean, that's not to say like that you just keep your mouth shut about everybody. I think that there needs to be a very clear sort of moral standard that we stand for in the world. Um, I think that we should be supporting the protesters in Iran like crazy.
Hmm,
I think we as libertarians should be supporting them. We should be supporting sort of real aspirations for liberty and for sort of republican societies.
I, I
Um,
I don't know what's the protest in Iran about. I'm just rather skeptical of the majority of people accept this revolutionary group in our group. Like I don't think I don't I think common Iranian is rather indifferent to those kinds of groups.
Sorry?
I mean, I think an average Iranian in are indifferent to those kind of protest groups. You know.
I don't know. I mean, like, I would say most Iranians actually, and I've met several people from Iran since I've been living over here. I'd say most young Iranians are quite liberal. Um, I don't think that they really like um, this sort of conservative religious society that's been imposed on them.
Yeah.
Um, I think they tend to enjoy Western culture. Like you even hear like God, there was this one documentary about like Iranian sex parties or something that people are like doing inside of their homes and stuff like this. Apparently, that's a thing in Iran. Um, like, people get plastic surgery in Iran. It's like these people want to be decadent Westerners. I feel like, and the original revolution in Iran wasn't really an Islamic revolution. It just so happened that the sort of really hardcore theocratic elements were able to seize the initiative at some point and gain power. Um, I don't think that really most people wanted that. It's very delicate because I would like there to be a way to support these people, and certainly morally.
Yeah. Do
So
you
not sort of intervening in such a way that it could end up being blowback. For example, I mean, the government is obviously hardcore anti-US.
the big Satan?
Yeah, they target us all the time with their propaganda. I mean, it's a pretty easy thing for them. Like if something goes wrong, just blame it on the US, basically. Um, and if it's perceived that we are like somehow, or if they're able to spin this as we're supporting these groups and point to some sort of evidence that even superficially indicates that, well, that really undermines people who are, trying to build a popular movement to make change in Iran.
Um,
I think that's where a lot of your more hardcore military interventionists really get it wrong. They don't really consider the impact, in particular, the impact of a foreign power coming in and in some way sort of determining how you're going to do things by force. Um, but at the same time, I mean, and this is where a lot of libertarians would be really fucking pissed off at me. I'm kind of a big believer in the UN Security Council and the idea of having sort of international law that governs how nations interact with one another, and also that sort of holds government to account for um, upholding fundamental individual rights and fundamental human rights. Um, and I don't see anything that's really contradictory to libertarians to think that way. I mean, we're not talking about a global government, we're talking about basically a contract among nations. Um, and
that's
I think that in some circumstances where is violating that contract, where they're initiating force against another country or they're initiating force against their population in some way, there are enough, if support is, say for example in the UN Security Council, is unanimous for going in, justification for doing that. I think that, in some way, like, if you approach things from sort of a classical liberal or minarchist point of view on the role of government, which is to uphold fundamental individual rights, well, you've also got to have I think, some system for trying to hold governments to these standards.
hey,
But like, I think this sort of system also, you also have to construct it so that you do get this sort of unanimous will to uphold these rights. I mean, I don't think that any of the U.S. interventions over the past 3 decades or so, even going back to Vietnam, were really wise or justified at all. But at the same time, in most of those cases, we also went in unilaterally, and that's never going to work, ever. Because there's going to be inevitable blowback to that.
so
And you're going to have countries that are going to criticize you for that decision. You establish a very dangerous precedent in the conduct among nations, that it's acceptable to unilaterally, perhaps even preemptively, invade another country with that poses absolutely no demonstrable imminent threat. So in any case, unilateral action should never be or unilateral intervention should never be taken. I don't think.
Do you want to hear the Austro-libertarian diagnosis and solution to this what must be done question, the big question? Um,
Go for it.
okay, let me gather my thoughts. In the in what I believe in the Austro-libertarian point of view is that the increasing centralization and compulsory governments over people, such as the EU, which is really bureaucratic and rather well, the common libertarian complaints for the
Yeah.
EU. Um, the thing is, they view centralization and also foreign policy and the history. Well, according to some neocons such as Fukuyama, but they see it as a rise of tyranny, and the Austro-libertarian cure is radical secession, um, restricted immigration, and also a strict non-interventionist policies and the total dissolving of the United Nations. Basically, let nations be their own nations and support free trade and have capitalistic policies for each country. Basically,
Yeah.
that story.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I guess you want me to comment on that, or
Yeah, I want your point of view from that. I consider myself a more Austro-libertarian, the
yeah, yeah, sure.
thinking of Rothbard, Hoppe, those type of guys.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that there's a hell of a lot to complain about in current sort of international bureaucracies. Um, I'm not a big fan of the World Trade Organization, for example. Um, I think that there's quite like basically my idea of an international bureaucracy would be delegated pretty much specifically toward international peacekeeping, um, and maintenance of peace, um, and sort of way to uphold um, fundamental individual rights, or to at least hold governments to those standards. I think that, honestly, if a constitutional republic that's can be set up that way to national government level, I don't see why that couldn't be done in some sort of international form. Obviously, with very strictly limited powers, and with the ability to secede if there's a feeling among a country that sort of the contract is being violated in an intolerable way. Um, yeah, so I mean, I'm not calling for like full-on global bureaucracy or anything like that. And there's some really legitimate complaints to make about the European Union and the way that it's structured, for example. In terms of free trade, I mean, I'm in favor of unilateral free trade. Um, I really don't think that there are great arguments against it. I mean, in the end, you're inevitably expanding the productive base of your economy. Um, you're able to, um, what you may lose out in terms of competition in some sectors. You're going to gain in other sectors. Um, I mean, even export sectors will improve because the prices of imports will go down. Ultimately, you're going to have more wealth added to your economy, period, when you have even unilateral free trade. Um, and costs will come down for businesses as well. So I mean, and Cato did a great paper about this back in um, the 2000s, where they analyzed what the impact would be of going just unilaterally free trade, and found that the benefits would be quite something for the US. So, I mean, I think that, you know, I'm not a huge fan of international trade bureaucracies, or, you know, the bureaucracies that have been built around trade agreements. Um, I'd just get out of all the damn trade agreements and unilaterally drop all barriers to trade, period. And, you know, it's countries that don't get on that bandwagon are the ones who are really going to end up losing out. I mean, for example, like there's been a lot made about how China runs its economy, and how they quite effectively sort of protect themselves by with some pretty aggressive policies on the yuan, pegging the yuan to the dollar to build up an export base. But if you look into the numbers very deeply, and there have been a number of analysts who've looked at this, they've it's really, a lot of their growth has been due to essentially non-performing loans, like especially loans to build infrastructure, and sort of cheap loans to inefficient enterprises, particularly by state banks. And there was a big bailout that occurred last decade, and now the it's starting to become clear just, you know, how much trouble China is in when it comes to debt. That really just hasn't generated the kind of benefits or the kind of growth that they've been relying on. And I mean, there have been some real warning signs for the Chinese economy as well. Growth rates have declined over the past couple of years, as sort of debt accumulation has gone way up. And they've done all of this in the context of cheapening the value of the yuan. I mean, the two really go quite hand in hand. Cheapening the international value and also cheapening the credit that's linked to it. And the fact that, I mean, that it's gotten to this point, it's not looking good for them right now. I don't think there are quite a few investors out there actually who are going short on the yuan at the moment, because they feel pretty certain that something's going to pop there sometime in the reasonable future.
The atmosphere is just driving down the consumer confidence.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, it's really, it really hurts China by taking that kind of approach to their economy. I mean, by opening up trade at first, they would have been sort of the benefactor, because, I mean, they had a pretty cheap labor supply at the time. But over the long run, as their economy grew and they were producing more, you know, their market's pretty open to other supplies coming in, maintaining price competition there. They could allow for even more growth to occur in that sense. And for that productive growth to reach more parts of society. If they had gone in that direction, they wouldn't have had to rely on approaches that they've taken, with basically taking their money into the shit and taking their credit into the shit. it would have been a much more organic process. There are some people, economists, who would argue that a little bit of protection at the beginning of development can be a good thing, but yeah, I'm just really not convinced. I mean, any time that you open, it's a pretty fundamental principle that any time that you open your markets or expand your markets, you're going to expand the amount of wealth that you create, or the amount of wealth that's going to be available to people. So
Yeah. I think I go into the end of stream here.
sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't. Are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't get that last part.
I think I go into the end of stream here.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Jesus, I'm sorry, I kind of rambled there for a bit.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah, you
Probably some
provided
points
me very valuable information.
but there were some points that I think I wanted to make, but and I guess it might be the same on your end. But hey, let's do this again sometime. Let's keep talking. I really enjoy talking with you.
Okay. Shout yourself out, Geolibertarian George.
So you guys, you can find me on Twitter at Geolib George.
Peace, and I hope you have a good week.
Yeah, likewise. Take care, dude.